Charles was in no mind to show the Stellar Technology people any mercy, not even those who had chosen to defect. His hatred for all of them was intense, and he pitied the victims of their experiments. Many of whom were now just body parts in specimen jars. Stellar Technology had been researching how to control people's thoughts, and they expected to succeed in their research. At that moment, though, they still had the power of life and death over anyone they recruited or captured. Seeing all the people in white lab coats, Helen was overjoyed. "Give me all your research data, and I'll spare your lives," she said to them. "In your dreams. We'll never give you our data," said one of the Stellar Technology scientists. Another researcher shouted at her, "Why should we give you the results of all of our hard work?" Someone else shouted, "Stellar Technology made all this possible. We're not letting you lot get your hands on it." Charles took a few steps toward the scientists and said to Tommy, "Rough them up a bit. That should shut them up and make them cooperate." Helen was speechless. He sounds like some mafia boss in the movies, she thought. I wonder why he's behaving like a common criminal. Charles had told Helen that he was Johnny Federer, someone related to Mayor Federer, to keep his real identity hidden, so she didn't realize that she was in the company of the man she was actually hoping to meet. Tommy cracked a heavy baton down onto the legs of one of the scientific researchers, and then he moved quickly onto his next target amid screams of agony. "This means war!" yelled one of the scientists, as a golden light shone from his body, showing the Dawn City team that he was a bio-altered type paranormal. But just as his body had started to glow, Tina attacked him ruthlessly. "You want war?" she shouted as she knocked him out. "How's this for a fight?" How can she do that without turning a hair? Helen thought in shock. Doesn't she have any empathy? How did she become that sort of a woman? If I join up with these people, will I end up like that too? What exactly am I getting myself into? More fighting broke out, with Tina and Tommy attacking the researchers until they surrendered, which didn't take long. The scientists tried to negotiate, and to show some goodwill to their captives, Tina bandaged the bloody nose of the man she had punched out. With no proper medicine on hand, she had to use salt to try to stop any infection. Helen felt numb with shock at what she had witnessed and couldn't remain silent any longer. "Is this how you guys usually behave?" she asked, wondering how she could have gotten them so wrong. They're clearly not principled at all, she thought. They're totally unscrupulous. But it looks like it's too late to jump ship. I guess I'm stuck with them now. Charles smiled at her and said, "Do you have any objections to our actions?" Helen thought, that's not a genuine smile. It doesn't reach his eyes. They're as cold as ice. Suppressing her fears, she forced herself to smile back at him. "No, not at all," she replied. "I'm just curious about you all and the way you operate." Her words sounded stilted and insincere, even to her own ears, but she didn't dare to act out of line around such obviously dangerous people. They seem so practiced, she thought. It's as though they behave like this all the time. They must be used to killing and leaving no trace of their victims. Tina passed some research files to Charles and nodded toward the scientists. "These people are no use to us," she said. "Do you want to deal with them or should I?" Helen felt weak at the knees and so shocked that she couldn't even cry. They really are killing machines, she thought. It's all they think about. Why did I ever think I should entrust my safety to them? They're just plain evil, killing people without batting an eyelid. If I follow them to see the mayor, will I be risking my own life? The future looks more worrying than I thought. Charles moved closer to her and asked, "Do you know about Stellar Technology's evil actions?" Helen was momentarily taken aback. "I heard some news from some Dawn City soldiers," she finally said. "It sounds like Stellar Technology had captured a lot of people and had forced them to work in the mines, but they had escaped with the help of an undercover agent. But I think only the mayor would have been able to defeat thousands of heavily armed guards by himself. He's the only one with a reputation like that." Charles pointed at a few glass jars and said to her, "Look at these small glass jars. What do you think is in them?" Helen shook her head. "I can't tell what it is. Is it some kind of meat? Are they trying to grow meat in the lab to solve the food crisis?" When Charles didn't immediately respond, she started to wonder. There's no way those are human body parts, right? Oh, gross. Her stomach churned with disgust as she gaped at the jars. Seeing the penny had dropped, Charles went on. "When we destroyed one of their bases, I saved a young girl who they were holding prisoner. Giving Helen a meaningful look, he continued. That girl is 8 years old now. Until I rescued her, they'd kept her in a coma so they could carry out experiments on her. I could take you to see her if you don't believe me. She'll tell you all about what happened. Helen clenched her fists and looked furious. Her instincts told her that Charles was telling her the truth. I've heard rumors of experiments on humans, she thought, but I didn't realize what was actually going on. This is just terrible. Are you telling me that those really are human body parts in those jars? Helen asked. Please tell me they're not from children. Nodding, Charles could see that she was now even more angry as well as distressed. She looked murderous, and he was pleased that he had made her understand the truth of what Stellar Technology was doing. These scum deserve to die, she said angrily. One of the scientists shouted at her, Science only finds answers by experimentation, and experiments need volunteers. Sometimes sacrifices have to be made. You might not be able to understand what we've been doing here, but know this. Only we can find a way to conquer the zombies and bring an end to the apocalypse. Only we can restore human civilization and the life we all once knew. When the Dawn City fighters heard the Stellar Technology scientists boast that only they had the ability to rid the world of zombies, they reacted with scorn. He's working for Stellar Technology, thought Charles, so he's automatically our enemy. But this one seems even more incapable of reason than most of them. He obviously has no problem working for them, and seems to think their vile experiments are a good thing. What a scumbag. An easy death isn't enough for someone like him, and there will be terrible consequences in the future for what they're doing. Charles's mind turned to his greatest and lifelong enemy, Leonard Shaw, and he clenched his fists. Now that guy's evil personified, thought Charles. Even if I were to be reborn as a totally different person, killing him would still be at the top of my agenda. And Leonard's time is nearly up. I'll soon have the opportunity I've been waiting all my life for, and I'll kill him openly. I just need to be a little stronger. Helen could see the murderous intent written across Charles's face, and it made her shiver. His expression was so fierce and so focused, and she felt frightened. Even if I get to meet Mayor Federer, he can't be any scarier than this relative of his, she thought. She only knew Charles by his reputation as the mayor of Dawn City, but she felt sure that he would be capable of killing thousands of Stellar Technology troops and the same number of zombies. She was convinced he would be even more frightening than the man standing with her at that moment, who she still thought was Johnny Federer. The Stellar Technology scientists awaited their fate nervously. 2 of you can live if you come and work for me, Charles told them. The rest of you will die. Helen's heart sank as she heard Charles's verdict. But they're truly evil, carrying out their terrible experiments on children, she thought. So perhaps they do deserve to die. But who can really judge anyone else? What she didn't know was that Charles fully intended to keep all the scientists alive in his energy storage space, and to work them until they became so weak that they died. He was determined to squeeze every last drop of value from his prisoners. They don't deserve to live, he thought, not after what they've done. One of the scientists spat in Charles's face and bravely said, Do you really think that we'll obey you and just agree to work for you? If you do, you must be stupid. Before she could say anything more, some of the other scientists started shouting over her that they were willing to do what Charles wanted. Another woman calmly started to unbutton her lab coat suggestively and winked at Charles. Hey, handsome. Let me go and I'll reward you in ways the others won't, she said seductively. The first woman, who told Charles they wouldn't cooperate with him, was angry, desperately hoping that Charles wouldn't think they would all fall in line like this one seemed to be doing. When the Stellar Technology scientists had gone into the bunker to escape the fighting, they'd all agreed that staying alive mattered more than anything else. Now they were shamelessly begging for their lives and using whatever means necessary to try to escape Charles's wrath. Charles smiled to himself, thinking, Do they really think I'll fall for that old trick, pushing a pretty woman under my nose as a temptation? An elderly scientist hurriedly said to Charles, We're very important people in our organization. If you treat us well, you'll be able to negotiate a huge ransom for our release. If you kill us, you'll have no bargaining power. Charles replied, But the people you work for have little regard for human life, or they wouldn't be employing you to formulate terrible experiments on innocent people. They expect everyone to sacrifice themselves for their cause and to keep their dreadful secrets. You're fools if you think otherwise, and you're even bigger fools if you think they care one iota about you, or any of your colleagues. Then addressing all of them, he said, "Show me what you're really made of. Whoever kills this old man with all his fine words will be the first to be allowed to live." The woman who had tried to seduce Charles grabbed an empty glass bottle, smashed it on the nearest lab bench, and slashed the old man's throat with it. In his last few dying moments, the elderly scientist thought, "So this is how she shows me her loyalty. I taught her all she knows, and this is how she repays me." Charles ordered Tina to take two of the scientists, including the woman who had killed the old man, and one other older scientist, outside of the bunker. And while she did as he asked, he sent Helen outside too. Then he rounded up all the useful supplies that he could find, as well as the remaining scientists, and placed them in his energy storage space. "There'll be a nice treat for the Hellhound later," he thought with a blood-curdling grin as he left the bunker. Once he, Tina, and Helen were outside, Charles remotely set off an explosion that burned the bunker to the ground. Looking back at the charred remains, Helen had mixed feelings. She was saddened by the loss of life, but happy that the team of scientists could no longer carry out their terrible experiments. Charles told Tina to take their two prisoners above ground. Then he walked over to Helen and said, "We'll soon be able to go to Dawn City and claim the reward we deserve." Helen nodded. "I've heard that Dawn City is the only place where paranormals and fighters live together peacefully, and where everyone's status is judged on their merits," she thought. "I hope it's really like the rumors say it is. A peaceful oasis in this dreadful apocalypse." Helen turned to Charles as the group walked toward Dawn City. "Ahead of us are the temporary living quarters that the Dawn Alliance used when they started recruiting members, back before they became Dawn City," she said. She was still traumatized by what she had seen in the bunker, but after a few moments, she started to look more like her usual self. Charles admired her resilience and her ability to stay focused on the task at hand, despite the trials of the world around her. "She's outstanding," he thought. "Really smart and beautiful. I'll make sure she feels safe here with me." Turning his attention to Tina, who was trying to talk to him, he started to feel a little impatient that she seemed determined to give him lots of administrative details that he really didn't need to know. "Doesn't she know by now I'm not the details guy?" he thought. "The strongholds outside the city are all looked after by a few of the deputy chiefs," Tina said. "Although we know some of them, we haven't been to all of their bases." Charles felt his energy beginning to dwindle, having to listen to what he considered to be irrelevant detail as Tina continued with her briefing. Dawn City has also become a small trading center because the people there often take food and weapons out to trade, so it was natural that it should develop as a market. Of course, the most important commodity is still food. Charles nodded. He had seen markets like this in his previous life. There weren't many settlements in the vicinity of Montreal, and the area was relatively safe. It had already been cleared of a large group of zombies by the Dawnians, so people felt able to go out in groups to hunt down supplies, and trade flourished. Tina carried on talking. "Did you know that according to statistics, only about 1/10 of the population of this region has survived? And that was only because the troops made huge efforts to save people. Beyond the immediate area, we don't really know how many survivors there are, but at least we don't need so much food now with so few people left to feed. Apart from food and water, it seems that most resources can be found by the people who go out searching." Charles frowned and asked, "Is there so much food in Dawn City that there's enough spare to trade?" "No," Tina replied. "Although the city is watered by a natural spring and some crops that mature quickly have grown well, I don't think there's enough of a surplus to trade with other settlements." Charles nodded, and Tina went on. "And of course, Dawn City is still growing and developing. The deputy mayors here should use what spare food there is to recruit more soldiers and horses, not sell to the outlying strongholds. They need to keep the main city as secure and independent as possible." Charles didn't bother to ask about the methods being used to develop their forces. So long as he could make Dawn City expand and grow stronger, he didn't mind how it was done. It was results that he valued, not the means of achieving them. "But I have to keep stressing the importance of secure and well-managed food supplies to everyone," he thought. "If we're wasteful now, it'll make life much more difficult if there's a shortage or supply chain issues in future." As Charles and his team were approaching the city, a shifty-eyed man came up to them. "Hello there, my friends," he said. "Are you intending to join us in Dawn City? If you all pay me 5 level 1 medicinal crystal cores, I'll let you join." Helen took a step toward him and said in an unfriendly tone, "Since when did anyone have to pay a fee to join Dawn City?" "Well," the shifty-eyed man replied,
We didn't need to charge a fee in the past, but now that Dawn City's reputation is growing and growing, there are far too many people wanting to live there. Pay my fee, and I can at least find you somewhere to stay."
Who is this guy? Charles wondered. Some fraudster, I'd say. I don't like the look of him at all. If he's using Dawn City's name for his own personal gain, then he needs to be dealt with. But before Charles could do or say anything, he sensed the man's heartbeat faster and his circulation speed increase. Can I sense those small movements inside of his body because of my preservation ability? He wondered. But his thoughts were interrupted by a man in a blue shirt.
"Hey, great to see you," the man said to Helen. "I thought you were dead."
He was about to hug Helen when she pulled out a knife and shouted, "Get lost! I mean it! Get out of here!" Helen looked poised to attack the man, her eyes flashing. She had already told Charles that she had severed her ties with her old teammates when they had abandoned her, and she hadn't expected to run into them again so soon. The man in the blue shirt looked upset and said, "That's not very nice. We thought that monster had killed you. If we'd known you were fine, we wouldn't have worried about you. We were all a team, so we'd have saved you if we thought you were still alive. Come on, don't be so aggressive over a misunderstanding." A small crowd was gathering, curious to see what was going on. Helen retorted, "You guys didn't even hang around to check if I was alive or dead, and you still have the nerve to tell me we were all good teammates? Is that how good teammates treat each other?" She sneered at the man. "When you guys just fled and left me for dead without even bothering to check on me, I decided never to have anything to do with you again. I'm part of a new team now, so you can get lost." "A new team, huh? Well, with this guy here?" he said mockingly, looking at Charles. He took a couple of paces forward, ready to teach Charles and the others a lesson. But when he looked more closely at Charles and realized who he was, he backed off, shaking. "Oh no," he thought, horrified with himself. "What have I done? This is the man who can kill hundreds of opponents in a matter of seconds. He summons terrifying creatures from hell, and he's Helen's new team leader?" Charles glared at him and said, "So come on then, what are you going to do?" The man in the blue shirt backed away and shouted to the crowd, "Look carefully at this man. Make sure you know what he looks like, and don't let him enter the market. He killed a lot of treasure hunters when they were looting the stellar technology ruins. If we let him in, he might go crazy and kill us all too. Be very careful of him." Charles laughed at the man in the blue shirt who had left Helen for dead in the previous battle. Typical of such a weakling, he thought. He won't dare to challenge me one-on-one, but he's happy to take refuge in the strength of a crowd. He wouldn't have dared speak to me like that and threaten me if there'd just been him here, and he thinks he has a reputation as a fighter just because he lives here in Dawn City. I know people outside think everyone here is a top-grade soldier, but this guy's picked the wrong man to threaten. Charles didn't care at all what the Dawn City market traders thought of him, and if any trouble kicked off, he knew he would come out of any investigation with his reputation intact. Murmuring spread through the crowd because the man in the blue shirt had attracted a lot of attention. "Who is he?" asked someone. "Who knows?" replied another. "Is what he said true?" "Difficult to tell," said the first. "He could be just another rabble-rouser trying to stir up trouble." The noise from the crowd grew, with people wanting to know if the man had spoken the truth. A few rough-looking young men came up to Charles, wearing military outfits and carrying machetes. Most of the onlookers took a few steps back, worried for their safety. Helen recognized the men as some more of her old teammates. She and Tina started talking quietly, not at all concerned for Charles. Tina knew he could defend himself very easily against this shower of young hotheads who had no idea who it was they were trying to take on. Tina asked Helen, "Why'd you decide to come and join us? It takes a lot of confidence to just walk up to someone and make yourself part of a team." Helen gestured toward Charles with her head. "He looked like someone I could rely on, and I certainly couldn't rely on my last teammates, as you can see." "Stick with us and you'll be fine," Tina replied. "We won't let your old teammate get anywhere near you tonight. I can tell what your old team's after, and I'll make sure you're well protected." They chattered on, and meanwhile, Helen's old team member hid himself among the crowd. Charles was surrounded by the group of young men who were staring at his backpack. Their faces gave away what they were thinking, and he could tell they were planning to steal the food he had in his backpack. "We need to see what's in your backpack," said one of them to Charles. "We think it could be stolen property, and we need to check it out. Take off your bag and empty it onto the ground." "Okay," said Charles, taking off his backpack. The young hooligans thought it would be easy to get away with their robbery because Charles seemed surprisingly happy to cooperate with their order. But as soon as they had plundered the backpack, Charles swung his sword, injuring all of them in one flick of his wrist. Lying on the ground and screaming with pain, the young soldiers were terrified. And seeing what a terrible state they were in, The crowd of onlookers fell silent. My preservation ability is indeed very powerful, thought Charles. He had felt it coursing through him when he had fought the troublemaking young men. It seemed to him that it had made his attack more effective. Even though it hadn't increased his physical strength, it had made him more agile. It must be that I can track my opponent's soul energy instantly and find any weaknesses they have in their attack and defense skills, he thought. It'll be great for a protracted battle. Charles was very impressed with this wonderful power. I'm certain it heightened my mental faculties too, he thought. That's probably why I didn't feel tired afterward. It increased my perception so I didn't need to use so much physical energy. Now whenever I attack someone, I'll be able to move faster and use less energy. All my other skills will be enhanced. This is great. Charles knew he would face enemies where standard attacks wouldn't be enough, even with the enhancement of his skills from his preservation ability. For fights that needed something more specialized, he would use his innate sword energy and his Sword of Death. He felt confident that he had chosen the perfect divine ability for himself. He knew that for those with poor combat awareness, the Terminator's sword ability might be a better tool. But for those with strong combat awareness such as himself, the enhancements brought about by the preservation ability were far more useful. In his previous life, Charles had made good weapon and superpower choices. As a younger man, he had been better suited to using his Terminator sword ability, a divine power that could directly increase his combat strength and power. But now that he had been reborn, his preservation ability was undoubtedly much better able to enhance his combat consciousness and skills. Looking at the young soldiers on the ground, Charles realized he no longer felt the need to kill them. He was in a better mood now, and killing people in the marketplace would create a very bad impression. However, further punishment was necessary, so Charles took back the bags of crystal cores from the young men and pocketed them for himself.
No, you can't do that, one of them shouted. That's our livelihood, cried another.
They were even more concerned about losing the vacuum-packed food that they had taken from Charles's backpack. Food with a long shelf life was a precious commodity that would help guarantee their survival in this time of great shortage and deprivation. Charles was unmoved by their cries and trod hard on the back of one of their hands. The crowd looked on in horror and moved further away as Charles's gaze turned back to the young man in the blue shirt. Run, run, thought the young man in the blue shirt. But under Charles's watchful eye, he couldn't move. His legs felt useless. Helen opened her mouth to say something, but thought better of it and closed it again quickly. She'd wanted to plead for her former teammates, but realized what might happen if she showed any weakness. She was a naturally kind woman, but knew that sometimes logic had to take priority. She was always willing to help others so long as it didn't cause any trouble, but she always put her own safety first. Charles walked toward Helen's old teammates, and they all started to feel even more nervous. Some were still on the ground, injured, while others were standing uncertainly near the young man in the blue shirt. "You did well," said Charles. "I did well?" the young man thought. What a strange thing to say. What does he mean? His mind had gone blank with fear, and he just couldn't understand what Charles was saying. He was even more bewildered when Charles threw the 3 bags of crystal cores that he had tried to steal back to him. "This is your reward," said Charles. "Go on, take it. You deserve it." The young man picked up the bags in something of a daze, but he wasn't going to argue with Charles. Charles then called to Helen and the others. "Come on, we need to be on our way." Once Charles and his group had left, Helen's old teammates beat up the young man in the blue shirt viciously, giving him no chance to explain. The crowd looked on, enjoying the spectacle. As Charles led his team away, he turned to watch what was happening. "What was that all about?" asked Helen. "Why'd you give him those bags back when he tried to steal them from you? I don't understand." Charles replied, "We're living in strange and difficult times, and humanity's survival is everyone's responsibility. Your old teammates are still part of the community, and even though they behaved badly toward you when they left you for dead, we shouldn't steal their supplies. I've shown them that they can't get away with leaving a fellow fighter for dead, and I've shown them how to act responsibly." He sighed before continuing. "And besides, we might need them in the future. I expect them to show loyalty to me now that I've helped them. They were probably expecting that I'd kill them all, but now they'll be extra grateful that I've given them back their lives, so they're more likely to support me in the future. Sometimes it's best to be magnanimous in victory. Today was one of those times." He knew that some of the crowd of onlookers had treated the altercation as a show, but those who were slightly savvier now understood one thing.
that they shouldn't easily fall for others' attempts at instigation. He'd meant the scene to serve as a lesson for them all. Helen paused for a moment, and then she said, "I wonder what happened to that man who tried to charge us extortionate amounts of money to find us accommodation." Charles replied, "I think he very sensibly ran off." Walking toward the market, Charles and his team could smell freshly baked bread and hear the shouts of the traders clamoring for the attention of passing customers. "Bread! Fresh bread! Hand-baked by Fire Element Paranormals! 12 crystal cores a loaf! Toilet paper! 3 packs for 1 crystal core! Get your kitchen equipment here! All you need for your kitchen: knives, cooking utensils, pots and pans, 5 full sets for only 1 crystal core." Hearing all the traders' calls, Hugh asked, "Why are their prices so ridiculous? Since when did toilet paper cost more than a set of pans? I can understand why fine foods are expensive, but toilet paper used to be cheap. What happened?" Helen explained to him, "Most of the paper factories have stopped working, and demand has been high, so that's why there's a shortage. And a shortage always raises prices. It's just basic supply and demand economics. There's no shortage of metals to manufacture kitchen equipment, and that's not the sort of thing people need to buy very often. So the price of those had stayed stable." Tommy looked at Charles and started to say, "No wonder you wanted." Charles's glare had him quickly change what he was saying. "I mean, it's a good thing you had the foresight to collect plenty of supplies." Tommy had wanted to talk about Charles's desire to build a factory on Dawn City territory, but knew that he was hiding his real identity from Helen. She still thought that Charles was another Federer entirely, and not the mayor of the whole city. The arrival of Charles and the others at the Dawn City market attracted a significant amount of attention, not because they looked suspicious themselves, but because of their captives. "Stop right there," a guard demanded. "We don't allow human trafficking here." A few people holding long knives and daggers halted Charles and his band. They looked at the 2 scientists behind Charles, who were tied with strong rope and led by Tommy. In order to keep them quiet, their mouths were gagged. Everyone regarded Charles with disgust when they saw how he was treating the 2 people. They didn't recognize him or know what he wanted, and it looked as though he was intending to sell the 2 unfortunates. The group of people with weapons jumped to the defense of the captives. "You can't treat people like that," someone shouted at Charles. "Let the woman go! Let both of them go!" Charles glanced coldly at the female researcher, making her feel as if she had fallen into a body of ice water. Then he withdrew his gaze. Since his true identity had yet to be revealed, he decided to continue with the pretense for the time being. Helen took a step forward. "These 2 people are from Stellar Technology," she said. "Their people have been declared enemies of the city. We've come here to claim the reward and join your ranks." She wanted to use the 2 captives in exchange for a position in Dawn City. She decided there was no harm in making her intentions plain. She also thought that if she found the people of Dawn City to be petty or untrustworthy, she could always change her mind about joining them. At the mention of Stellar Technology, everyone quickly changed their tune. "If they're from Stellar Technology, that's another story," someone shouted. "I thought all those devils were dead. We need to punish them." "You did a great job capturing them." "I didn't think anyone would be able to claim the reward." "We'd love to have you join us." Charles thought it was understandable that they would change their minds so quickly. 3 days ago, they had wiped out Stellar Technology's full army. Most of the enemy had been killed by Charles personally. Since communication devices and telegrams were now established methods of communication, the speed of news reporting had dramatically improved. With the added influence of Dawn City's propaganda, people couldn't help but respect them. Charles thought it was interesting that if the Dawnians had killed a small group of people, they would likely have been identified as murderers. But since they had killed 10,000 people from a detested organization, it qualified them as heroes. His own image as a fearless and dedicated ruler was now well established in the eyes of most people. Obviously, since the Dawnians wanted to appeal to the supposed strangers at the gate, they had to assure them that they held no sympathy for Stellar Technology. Many of them had participated in the siege of the former company themselves. Acknowledging that anyone good worked for Stellar Technology would reduce the city's actions to theft or assault. They therefore had to stand by the assertion that Stellar Technology only consisted of the worst kind of people. No one dared to defend the captives further, for fear of retribution from the rest of the crowd. Helen smiled at Charles. "Wow," she said quietly. "Dawn City's reputation is apparently true. All right, we can go in now." She led Charles into the stronghold. There was a market beyond the gate, and a number of merchants lifted up wares as Charles's team passed by. One stall caught Charles's attention, and he suddenly stopped. "How much is this?" he asked the stallholder, pointing to a stone. The owner of the stall was a young man wearing a black hooded sweater. He was sitting in a position that cast a shadow across the upper half of his face. Because of the commotion caused by Charles's arrival, everyone's eyes were focused on him and his group. The fact they were newcomers to Dawn City added another layer of intrigue, and everyone watched them closely. 3 level 4 medicinal crystal cores, the youth replied. When everyone heard the young man's price, it caused an uproar. 3 level 4 crystal cores? Someone said. Is that all? You can ask a lot more than that. No, he can't, someone replied. That little rock isn't worth that. Level 4 crystal cores are from level 4 zombies, the stall owner said. If these guys are higher than level 4, they can afford to pay it. It's a valuable object, and I'd say 3 level 4 crystal cores is a bargain. The medicinal crystal cores had 2 uses. One was to support cultivation, and the other was to replenish the owner's energy consumption during battle. The higher the crystal core's level, the faster it replenished energy, and the higher the level of a monster, the harder it was to kill. Level 4 zombies could only be killed by a team of paranormals that were all level 4 or higher, so level 4 medicinal crystal cores were a very valuable resource. Charles laughed. Do you even know what this is? He asked. Nope, the youth said indifferently. Whatever it is, I can't use it. I'm sure in the right hands it's worth a lot more than I'm asking, but it's of no use to me. I might as well use it to hit my enemies across the head, but I do know it can be used against level 4 zombies. It's definitely worth more than 3 level 4 crystal cores. There were 2 ways to determine the value of an unfamiliar item. One was to sense the purity of the energy contained within it. The other was to judge the hardness of the item itself. If the item met the right criteria, it was considered precious. The youth clearly had some confidence in his ability to value items. He believed that the stone he had was at least as hard as a level 4 zombie's skull. Tommy looked suspicious. If you know it's worth more than you're asking, why don't you raise the price? He asked. I don't have time to study it, replied the young man simply. Charles appreciated his honesty. The man knew that the stone was worth something, but he wasn't willing to waste his time trying to work out what its capabilities were. Charles knew that people's time was valuable. The man obviously knew the limits of his capabilities, and he wasn't willing to waste his time or energy trying to examine the properties of a complicated object that exceeded his skill level. Instead of haggling over some unknown object, the man could exchange it for 3 level 4 crystal cores and increase his strength immediately. It was worth it to him because he wanted to increase his chances of survival. Some people were born with an innate knowledge of how to survive, and many of them were able to adapt quickly to their environment. That kind of talent was highly coveted during the new era. Charles twisted his hand and summoned a black dagger. If you tell me where you found this rock, I'll give you this, he said, offering the blade to the young man. The man took the dagger and investigated it with his soul energy. His expression changed swiftly from nonchalance to shock, and he handed the dagger back to Charles. I picked it up by chance on the road, he said carefully. I don't remember exactly where it was. You should keep this dagger. Charles handed it back to him and smiled. It's okay, he said. Consider a payment in advance for when you remember. Hugh and the others watched Charles's odd exchange with the young man with deeply confused expressions. They knew precisely how valuable the black dagger was. It had been forged from a hive queen's teeth and had the ability to slice through everything, even zombies, with little to no resistance. The young stallholder looked around nervously, and then he asked Charles in a hushed voice, What exactly do you want? Many others were intrigued by the bizarre encounter, and they watched them both intently, trying to eavesdrop on the conversation. They didn't know what the stone was, but they had already ascertained that it was some kind of precious item. If it wasn't important on its own, it evidently had a hidden value for the stranger. They had all seen movies about such occurrences in the old days. Charles could see that the young man wasn't going to part with the stone until he had some kind of explanation. He raised his voice slightly and said, It's called a phantasm stone. Legend has it that it comes from the riverbank where the underworld meets the river. They say that nothing grows around the location where these stones originate. The surrounding plants turn black and wilt. When you remember where you found the stone, I want you to find me in Dawn City and tell me. Both Charles and the stallholder knew that he did in fact know where he had found the item, but Charles was happy to let him take his time. The surrounding people who had been staring at the young man with greedy, malicious eyes also withdrew their gazes. They presumed that the location he had found, the stone, was so inconspicuous that he hadn't thought twice about it. Helen rolled her eyes at Charles. "You haven't joined Dawn City yet," she said. "Are you only becoming a citizen so you can boss around the merchants?" Charles smiled back. "Don't you think I'll stand out here?" "Narcissist," she muttered softly. But she kept her criticism quiet. She had witnessed Charles's strength with her own eyes, and she knew he had at least some right to be arrogant. Once the young stallholder was satisfied that most of the crowd's attention had moved on, he heaved a sigh of relief. "How do I find you?" he asked Charles. "It's not necessary for you to speak with me personally," Charles replied. "It's not a secret. Anyway, I've already paid you in advance. If you do manage to remember where you found it, find a secluded place inside Dawn City and leave me a note somewhere inconspicuous. I suggest you leave it on the wall. You don't need to worry about the note being read by others. The information's of no use to anyone but myself." Charles knew that there was no need to worry about others coming across a note with the location on it. No one with lower-level abilities would be able to use the stone, let alone refine it. He doubted many of them would recognize a phantasm stone if they saw one lying around, so he wasn't worried about keeping the location a secret. The members of the crowd seemed to regard the young man with less hostility once they knew that there was no hidden mystery to the stone's location. Charles had ensured to keep their conversation loud. He knew that people had been intrigued by the stone and its potential power. If he made it too obvious, he knew it would put a target on the young man's back. He wasn't entirely sure why he felt the need to protect him. After all, the stallholder was a stranger to him. The young man nodded appreciatively. He accepted the dagger, put away the remaining trinkets at his stall, pulled the hood even lower over his face, and left the market. A few people followed him subtly. The young man glanced back at them once, but he didn't increase his pace or pay them any attention. Charles assumed he had done his best to ensure the young man's safety, and he didn't worry further about what might become of him. "What's so special about that phantasm stone?" Helen asked Charles. Charles examined her closely and paused for several seconds. "If it's used to forge a weapon," he said, "it increases the weapon's death attributes. But increasing special damage, of course, has its own share of negative effects. If you're hunting, you can't eat the meat of any prey that has been injured or killed using that weapon." He understood the kind of person that Helen was. She was the type who would do anything to help others. Once they had relieved the threat to the young man's safety, she seemed to visibly relax. Charles didn't mind forms of kindness that didn't cause him any trouble. The only time he took exception to people being kind was when they did it to the detriment of themselves or to those around them. He didn't mind that some people were happy to sacrifice themselves for others. In fact, he admired it. But he took umbrage when his own safety was compromised as a result. Helen heaved a sigh of relief when she saw that Charles wasn't about to lecture her about her sentimentality. Her former teammates had always told her not to meddle in other people's business. However, she felt that offering help to others when she could enabled her to retain her humanity. It was how she kept the link to the old era alive. She knew it was easy to disassociate from others and become a monster, and she had no intention of becoming a cold, heartless shell of a person. Charles looked at the people around him. They had resumed their gossip, and some of them were eyeing the phantasm stone. Charles held up his left hand, and a ball of glimmering flame appeared in it. The onlooker swiftly retreated. "I want to give a warning to all of you wondering about taking this stone," Charles said threateningly. "You should know that to be able to refine it, it's imperative that the owner is able to fully control true fire." The crowd immediately lost any thought of stealing the stone. They muttered among themselves, "He's a level 5 paranormal. Let's get out of here." No wonder he managed to take out Stellar Technology. He'll definitely be a strong recruit for Dawn City. What if he's here to challenge the mayor for authority? The mayor's only a level 4. I think he's after the mayor. True fire was the symbol of a level 5 paranormal. Most of the people present had never seen a level 5 paranormal before, and even level 4 paranormal sparked fear within most people. None of them could afford to provoke a level 5. When Charles had effectively scared away everyone who appeared to have dubious intentions, he continued his journey through Dawn City's stronghold. Helen was a little uneasy. but she still lowered her head and followed him. I can use that stone, thought Charles. It sounds like there's a place of death around here. If that's the case, the lightning cadaver serpent can evolve. Charles knew that once the creature evolved, it would also carry the death attribute. He recalled from his previous life that the lightning cadaver serpent had shown brilliantly when it had reached level 5, and it had caused a disaster. Countless people had surrounded it, but they had had no way to kill it. This time, Charles decided that he would cultivate the serpent somewhere more private, but he was eager for it to reach the pivotal checkpoint of level 5. The Phantasm Stone could strengthen the lightning cadaver serpent's death attribute, and if he could find a place of death, then the serpent could evolve faster. Once it reached the 5th level, it would be able to assume the title of dragon. The serpent's strength was intrinsically linked to Charles's own. Every time Charles's power increased, so did the serpent's. And every time Charles gained a level, he had more confidence in his ultimate goal. Just you wait, Leonard, he thought. You won't know what's coming until it's too late. When the group entered Dawn City through the stronghold, Helen explained her purpose to a few of the guards. The Dawnians didn't know who Charles was, since when the Dawn Alliance had been established, they had all been recruited by Charles's deputies. Charles had little to do with day-to-day activities and concerned himself primarily with tactical matters. The people guarding the wall were mainly new recruits, and consequently, they hadn't been introduced to him in person. The transition from Alliance to City had taken roughly a month, and people were still adjusting. The people of Dawn City were generally cooperative. When they accepted the newcomers and their 2 prisoners, they arranged to have them all escorted into the city center on a small bus. After all, the credit they had earned by capturing Stellar Technology employees was enough to secure people's trust and help. I can't believe we're going to become citizens of Dawn City, Helen exclaimed. They boarded the small bus that would take them to the city center. Helen was so excited that her face was shining and slightly red. She had no concerns about being denied citizenship. It was well known that becoming a member was easy, provided new recruits accepted the rules. When the group had been called the Dawn Alliance, Charles had said that no one would be given anything for free. The same was true of Dawn City. Charles gave everyone the opportunity to use their own labor in exchange for anything they wanted. The other chief commodity was crystal cores. For diligent people, it was a wonderful arrangement. Only those who naively thought they could convince paranormals to protect them, or people who kidnapped military people to protect themselves, opposed the rules. Many paranormals had established shelters and used their own powers to benefit everyone. Those kind of arrangements naturally attracted many people. But Charles understood that everyone's power was limited, and not even the high and mighty paranormals could protect everyone. Anyone who placed their faith in others with no intention of improving themselves would be eliminated before the end of the era. Aren't you going the wrong way? Hugh asked the bus driver cautiously. I saw the large buildings on the way into the city, and I assumed the city was in the other direction. They didn't want to draw attention to their true identities, so Hugh was careful to cover his knowledge of their position as well as he could. However, as soon as he suggested to the local bus driver that they were going the wrong way, he aroused the suspicion of everyone on the bus. The atmosphere changed drastically. Helen's face turned pale, and she quietly gripped a dagger at her waist. She noticed that there were more than 30 people on the bus, and everyone was armed with weapons. Several had badly concealed machine guns. She shot a nervous look at Charles. If they had been kidnapped, Charles was their only hope. A jovial, middle-aged man sitting next to Charles decided to alleviate the tension. It's dangerous to interrogate fugitives, he explained, nodding toward the 2 scientists. We're going to the Dawn City laboratory. It's not far from the city, around 10 miles away. But don't worry, we'll take you to the mayor's mansion. Since an official mayor's mansion hadn't been built after Dawn City had been renamed, Charles's residence was referred to as the mayor's mansion. The others on the bus smiled. Several of them agreed loudly. Yeah, you don't have to worry. They might have important information. We ought to ensure we can extract it efficiently. Charles's team made loud noises of understanding and hoped that they were convincing enough in communicating the idea that they were from out of the city. Charles put on a friendly smile and said to the middle-aged man, Thanks for letting us know. I'm a level 5 paranormal, so I know you wouldn't lie to me, especially when you're sitting right beside me. His overly pleasant demeanor did little to hide the thinly veiled threat. He wanted the man to know that if anything happened, Charles would ensure he was the first to die. The good-natured man became even more amiable. "Yes, of course," he exclaimed. "I'm sure that with your strength, just moving a finger would kill us all. Why on earth would we lie to you?" Helen appeared even more anxious. She didn't like that Charles had exposed his level. It might mean that the bus patrons were more prepared in the event of a battle. What if these people are bad? She wondered. Then what'll we do? She knew that she and the others had to try and get off the bus. She decided to try and signal to Charles that they needed to find an opportunity to escape. She knew that she was probably being paranoid, but she felt that the locals on the bus weren't trustworthy. She also felt guilty for bringing the others into such a dangerous situation. Someone's communicator went off on the back seat of the bus. The man answered it and said a few words to the caller. He appeared to be pleased with whatever the caller said. "Good. Good. Really? That's great." When he hung up the call, the man approached Helen. "The mayor already knows about the situation, and he's decided to personally bring the scientists in for interrogation," he said. "When we arrive, you can see the mayor immediately." When Helen heard the news, she felt ashamed for thinking the worst. She decided she'd been too hasty to judge the others. Tina, however, was deeply uncomfortable. The nerve of these frauds, she thought. I can't believe anyone would be stupid enough to pretend to be Charles. Could it be that they've established a stronghold in the city? How could they hide something like that? When the real Charles heard that Mayor Federer was coming to pick them up personally, the corner of his mouth pulled into a small smile. He was fascinated to see where the ruse was going. He decided to stir the pot. "You know, I really don't think that this Mayor Federer is as strong as the rumors say," he said casually. "I think I'd really like to have the opportunity to spar with such an expert. I wonder whether he'd be willing to grant me that honor." He tried to fill his voice with as much enthusiasm as he could. He knew that coming across as overconfident in his own strength would annoy the suspicious people on the bus. But the middle-aged man didn't seem annoyed by Charles's boasting. Instead, he said with a relaxed tone, "Let's not talk about fighting Mayor Federer. He's a great champion, and I'm sure he doesn't have the time for trivial sparring. Besides, that's assuming you can pass the test to become a citizen." After they had been on the bus for more than 50 minutes, the sky turned dark. But the atmosphere in the bus had become considerably more harmonious. The good-natured middle-aged man introduced himself as Nick Barrett. He was particularly talkative. During the journey, he easily managed to dissolve everyone's hostility. Even Charles had begun to doubt whether Nick was part of whatever plot was unfolding. "That's Dawn City over there," Nick said. He pointed out the city with obvious pride. "But Mayor Federer has decided to come to the experimental base to meet you. He said your contribution of the two scientists is enough to welcome you all to the city as his personal associates. It's going to be dark soon, so I doubt he'll return home today. Perhaps he'll stay in the experimental base for the night." Tommy and the other two were completely mystified. Nick had gestured in the direction of Dawn City, so it was certainly nearby. They wondered whether it was possible these renegades had managed to establish an experimental base. They couldn't see how they would have managed it without attracting suspicion. It looks like I was overthinking, Helen thought. She barely managed to hold in a sigh of relief. Although they hadn't been taken to the center of Dawn City, it did seem as though there was a legitimate reason for the detour. Besides, it seemed the imposter of a mayor had his own ideas about what to do with the scientists. Dawn City's reputation and their violent feud with Stellar Technology were well-known facts. Helen decided that it wasn't her place to dictate to their leader how to deal with prisoners of war. Charles could barely contain his laughter. He couldn't believe the audacity of the group of rebels. Since their current location was next to Dawn City, they were still technically within the city's perimeter. Although he didn't bother himself with the internal affairs or development of the city, that didn't mean that this group could build an experimental base under his name right next to his city without obtaining his consent. He decided that regardless of whether the rebels were friends or enemies, he would destroy their base. The bus finally arrived outside a factory that occupied a vast area outside the city border. There was movement inside, and some people emerged from the building with smiles on their faces. Nick explained to everyone, "There are many of us in Dawn City who like to go hunting late at night or take other risks, but not everyone makes it back into the city before dark. Sometimes we're injured and don't have time to rush back to headquarters in the city center, so we built this stronghold to recuperate in. Our base is just a half a mile ahead." Charles narrowed his eyes slightly. He knew that people had constructed bases for adventurers outside the city before. Their functionality was precisely as Nick said, to give people a place to rest and shelter from danger. But this hidden base was totally unsanctioned. He understood the thinking behind the location. They used the existing stronghold as a cover. If they placed their experimental base right next to it, even if anyone from Dawn City discovered it, it could be explained away as a place to store supplies or something similar. That way, no one would suspect it or feel as though it needed to be reported. Of course, if Olivia had investigated it personally, she would have immediately seen the base for what it was. But Charles doubted that anyone else who decided to rest there, even Miranda, would have been able to uncover the truth. It's actually a great scheme, he had to admit to himself. He was impressed with the deception and was more intrigued than ever to know who the mastermind was. Whose idea was this? He asked. He tried to picture the deputy mayors in his mind. He was embarrassed to realize that he didn't know any of them by name, except for Olivia. He did, however, know their faces, on account of the fact that he had held several meetings with them all. But during the meetings, Charles was always occupied with the bigger picture. He never paid any attention to the other people who were present, and he interacted almost solely with Olivia. When the Alliance had changed its name, the deputy leaders had become deputy mayors. They didn't leave a strong impression on Charles, and their titles were symbols of their tenure more than anything else. They were obviously good fighters and organizers, but they answered to Charles's vice leaders and not directly to him. Once they all reached the base, Helen and a couple of the others stepped off the bus. The door of the base opened, and they were greeted by a long-haired young man. A few paranormals followed him and nodded to Nick in welcome. The long-haired man said warmly to them all, "Our mayor is waiting inside. Please come in." Helen's heart felt as though it was about to burst. She could feel her face turning red. She was both excited and nervous to meet her idol. "Will he see us so soon?" she asked in a squeaky voice. She no longer had any doubts in her heart about the authenticity of the group. Dawn City was only a few miles away, and they were right next to an official resting stop. She disregarded any other concerns. Hugh emerged from the bus and greeted the long-haired man with a tight-lipped smile. "James," he said, "long time no see." Tina and Tommy also smiled at him. The smiles weren't friendly. They were dangerous smiles, like the kind a crocodile might give an animal at a watering hole. The man named James looked slightly faint when he saw the three familiar faces. "You!" he cried. "What are you doing here?" Although he was evidently caught off guard, he managed to remain calm. He forced himself to smile back in an attempt to make himself look more natural. His eyes scanned the windows of the bus, but because he was so far away, and Charles was sitting on the other side of the bus, he didn't see the real mayor. Charles, however, could hear everything. Helen was confused. "Do you guys know each other?" she asked. How can they know each other? She wondered. Are they old acquaintances? Her intuition told her that things weren't that simple. "Let me introduce James Burbank," Tina said. When he was in the Dawn Alliance, there were 6 openings for deputy chiefs. One of the existing leaders felt that James wasn't qualified enough to be among their ranks, so he gave his position to someone more suitable. Funny, there was no argument or unpleasantness at the time. Have you been plotting ever since then? James clenched his teeth but kept his temper. "Well, I won in the end, didn't I?" he said viciously. "If I'd taken the position, it could have been me dead on that battlefield instead of Neil." Neil was a former deputy chief who had died during a battle. Charles barely remembered him. He was only concerned with those who survived battles. If Tina hadn't reminded him of James's name, he would have never guessed it in 1,000 years. "If you all know James," said Helen, "why didn't you ask him to show us to the mayor's mansion?" "Oh, we know each other," Tommy said. Then he said to James, "You are always jealous of Neil. Why didn't you just come to us if you were upset about being overlooked for the position?" "I didn't need your useless hierarchy," James spat. "I decided to do my own thing." He put his hand behind his back and gave a signal to the people behind him in the base. Helen was still in a state of utter confusion when she saw the people with machine guns appear in the windows of the base. Then more appeared on the roof. She managed to shake herself back into her senses. "Over there," she shouted. She used the hilt of her dagger to smash the nearest window. Then she tried to pull herself and Charles outside of the bus. All of her hopes were crushed. She didn't understand how the city of her dreams had ended up disappointing her so badly. She knew that everyone in the world longed for a utopia where there were no problems. Her fantasy land had been Dawn City. She didn't understand what had happened for the meeting to end that way. "You need to get out," Helen shouted at Charles when she realized he wasn't following her. The people on the bus advanced on him, and she fell into despair. They took out daggers that they had concealed on the ride earlier and attacked. A sniper on the roof of the base pulled the trigger. This is it, Helen realized. A bullet flew toward her. Her evolved eyesight allowed her to see its trajectory clearly, but she knew she couldn't dodge it. But just as she wondered what it would feel like to die, a hand flashed out in front of her. Helen was stunned. Charles had moved faster than she had thought possible and had intercepted the bullet. He dropped the metal ball harmlessly to the ground. Did he just catch that with his bare hands? She thought in awe. Her mind went blank. She couldn't believe that anyone's reflexes could work that quickly, nor had she ever heard of anyone being able to catch a bullet with their bare hand. Screams began to ring out from within the bus, and a violent battle ensued. The air was so thick with soul energy that it caused the entire bus to disintegrate, and Helen found herself outside once more. She looked around and saw Tina and the other two. She hadn't expected that they would escape the attack alive, but they all stood in front of her, seemingly without any injuries. The people who had attacked them now lay motionless on the ground. It appeared that Tina and her crew hadn't even given the attackers the chance to beg for mercy. The remaining assassins then looked nervously at the newcomers. They examined the bodies of their fallen comrades and couldn't believe that Tina and her friends' weapons had been able to cut through the rebels' bulletproof vests with such ease. "What are you?" Helen asked Tina. She was suddenly filled with the realization that these people couldn't possibly be human. They were all stronger than anything she'd ever encountered, paranormal or monster. She supposed that their weapons could have been the reason they had won, but that didn't negate the fact that they each had killed several people within a few seconds. The remaining 20 rebels didn't dare to take another step forward. It was a testament to the strength of Charles's team. In the base, a few guns spat their bullets harmlessly toward the group. That's useless considering he can catch them with his bare hands, Helen thought. She barely had time to register the thought when she saw Charles's hands move so quickly that she could no longer see them. He waved them several times through the air, and all the bullets from the machine guns disappeared. Before she could understand what had happened, the shooters from the base began to scream. It seemed that Charles had somehow returned fire, and had catapulted the bullet back into the building, almost at the same time he had received them. Helen wasn't sure how much more she could handle. She couldn't believe what she was seeing in front of her. What he was doing was completely unprecedented. She had never seen anyone with moves like that, not even in a movie. "It's my preservation ability," Charles explained briefly. He looked at his fingers. There were some red marks on them, but those disappeared in the blink of an eye. Although his body could block bullets when he used his conscious defense, he still needed to use his own energy to do so. If he kept blocking bullets, it was only a matter of time before he ran out of energy. It was just a matter of whether he or his enemy ran out first. As for his ability to take the bullets and throw them back with equal force, that was entirely due to the preservation ability. It was well documented in ancient books that the preservation ability was able to increase a person's reaction and perception, including recovery ability. However, Charles was only beginning to understand the full extent of its capabilities. In situations where it was able to operate in tandem with the divine seed, Charles was able to determine the trajectory of all the bullets almost instantaneously, with virtually no damage to his own body. The ability relied almost entirely on intuition and instinct. He felt as though he could catch the bullets, so he could. Once he had the bullets in his hand, he sensed that he could fire them back at his target with equal force. That also became a reality. He then had another strong feeling that was sparked by his intuition. The sniper on the roof turned around and fled when he realized that Charles was fighting back. He took off as fast as he could and leaped down the other side of the roof. Why does that guy seem so familiar? Charles wondered. He was slightly confused, but his hand didn't slow down. He threw a red steel bead into the building. The bead was made from a crimson flame energy gem that Charles had combined with an explosive flame amulet. Together they created a catastrophic explosion. Charles could sense they had incapacitated the sniper. The man was on the cusp of death, but his soul energy was still present. Charles knew it was only a matter of time before the man succumbed to his injuries. At the same time that Charles was destroying the base, Tina's battle was also drawing to a close. None of her team had sustained any injuries from any of the machine gun bullets. Instead, she and the others had managed to block them using their weapons. Charles had taught them personally how to block bullets, and there was a significant distance between them and the machine guns. The attackers finally retreated behind James, leaving more than 10 bodies behind. They held their swords with trembling hands. They didn't know whether they should continue fighting or flee. What have I signed up for here? Helen wondered. Everything had suddenly become very unreal. We need to run, she shouted at Charles. I know you're super powerful and all, but we're no match for everyone in Dawn City. She wasn't sure how she had ended up in such a mess, but no matter how strong Johnny Federer was, she knew that even he wouldn't stand a chance against the entire Dawn City. Even if they fought well, Mayor Federer would hardly pardon them after their inevitable defeat, just because he was impressed by their combat skills. Charles smiled and patted Helen's shoulder. It's okay, he said softly. You'll see. You, said James to Charles. Why are you here? Those who recognized Charles had gone pale and had frozen in place. This, stammered one of them. What do you mean for this to happen? We didn't know it was you. The people from the bus were confused. They wondered who these newcomers were who had struck such fear in their boss. It occurred to Helen that these people knew Tina, Hugh, and Tommy. The man leading them certainly looked afraid, as if he had come across these three before. He and his followers looked at the group like mice seeing a cat. Helen joined the dots and made a guess. So it's true, she said to Charles. You really are Mayor Federer's relative? Charles and the others didn't reply. They were too focused on James and his crew. Charles stepped toward James. Submit, he said in a voice calm but authoritative. James's mind went blank. He dropped to the ground, his legs losing all control and sending him sprawling. He found he had no strength to stand up. Sweat seeped from his forehead as his mind raced with thoughts of what kind of punishment Charles had in mind. Is he going to destroy everything? He wondered. It seemed absurd now that not long ago he had fantasized about defeating Charles in battle and gloating over his dead body. He had known all along, of course, that the penalty for acting against Charles would be severe. But until that moment, he hadn't considered the reality and likelihood of such an outcome. Now that they were face to face, he felt cowardly and weak. There was no way he could ever hope to win in a fight against the man standing before him. He didn't even have the courage to make the first strike. And so, when Charles had ordered him to submit to his authority, there had been no question that he would obey. Is he going to kill me? He wondered. Of course he is. I want to escape, but I can't move. His heart was beating fast. The longer Charles simply stood there saying nothing, the deeper James's fear became. He couldn't move a muscle. The people around him looked at James with disgust. What had become of this Dawn City big shot? They had heard he was second only to the deputy mayor, and yet now there he was, collapsed on the ground and paralyzed with fear. Charles ignored them. Instead, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, he cleared his throat, tapped his feet on the ground, and levitated to the top floor of the factory. Watching him float upwards, James's team was scared out of their wits as they wondered what kind of being could defy the laws of physics. This preservation ability is pretty useful, Charles thought, rising up through the air. Did I choose the wrong ability in my past life when I opted for the Terminator sword ability? He dismissed the thought. In his previous life, he hadn't had the experience and training to use the preservation ability correctly, but now he was perfectly suited to it. Although it looked almost godlike to the people below, the principle behind his movement was simple enough. His physique meant that he would have been able to simply leap to the top of the building, but he would have needed to run and squat before making the jump. Doing so in front of so many people wouldn't have looked anywhere near as intimidating, so it was helpful that he could use his preservation ability to lift his body with no apparent effort whatsoever. At the top of the building, he found the sniper, lying mutilated and close to death after the blast. He approached the man. The sniper was middle-aged, stubbled, and in mercenary clothes. Gasping and spluttering from his injuries, he looked at Charles with determination. He sent a column of blue flame in Charles's direction, but the attack was weak. It didn't stall Charles's advance. Nevertheless, Charles could see how strong the sniper's determination was. He had been injured badly in the explosion, and yet was still fighting for his life. When he got closer, Charles recognized the sniper as the one who had led the ambush against Alice and him on their journey to Cambridge. It had been this sniper who had shot at the tires of their truck before trying to steal the food in the vehicle. After the ambush had failed, the man had escaped, though not before bursting all the tires on the vehicle and drawing countless monsters to their location. Even with all of Charles's strength, he and Alice wouldn't have been able to survive if it hadn't been for the lightning cadaver serpent. Was he just a mercenary all along? Charles wondered. Although mercenaries were forbidden, some still found illicit ways to enter the country. Charles wasn't much in the mood for pondering where the sniper had come from, though. In an instant, he engulfed the man with hellfire, reducing him into ashes. By this point, he had experienced too many battles to become emotionally invested in bearing grudges. He found it easier to simply dispatch his enemies and then move on to the next duty, as though ticking tasks off a to-do list. He didn't harbor any feelings for his victims, whether enmity or admiration. If Charles didn't kill his enemy would kill him. It was as simple as that. Below, James was still struggling on the ground, trying to work out his next move. He went up to the roof, he thought. Should I take advantage of the situation and try to get away? But he must have gone up there for a reason. He could come back any time. If he finds me trying to escape, he'll surely kill me. No, this must be a test. If I stay here and show that I'm willing to surrender, he'll spare me. This was his only saving grace, that in the end, he was insignificant to Charles. He thought that as long as he was willing to cooperate, he would be spared. Charles leaped from the top of the building and descended to the ground. Although he had dispatched an enemy who had once harmed him, he didn't feel any thrill of revenge. He had taken out so many of his enemies already that it had become a completely emotionless task. I didn't even try to run away, said James, still on the ground. Charles sneered. He could tell that the reason James hadn't tried to escape was that he was trying to save face any way he could. This was the same reason he had given over his power so quickly. In fact, Charles understood that when somebody fell out of favor with public opinion, their decision to hand over power wasn't really a decision at all. I surrender, he said. I don't have any orders to harm you. Is that so? Asked Charles. Then tell me why you yourself gave the order to attack me just now. James closed his eyes, unable to answer as Charles's divine might rendered him speechless. Next, Charles turned to the rest of the people. Somebody tell me what's going on here, he said. James's men looked at each other, none of them daring to be the one to answer first. Please, said Charles, turning to Tina, Hugh, and Tommy. Encourage one of them to speak. Hugh nodded and struck one of the onlookers on the back of the head, sending him sprawling to the ground. The rest of the men panicked. Okay, we'll talk. Whatever you want to know, we'll tell you. There were more than 20 survivors there. Each of them understood that there was nothing to be gained from acting tough. Watching this unfold, Helen wanted desperately to cover her eyes with her hands, but she fought the urge. She turned to Charles and asked, Who are you? Of course, she already had some ideas. James and his men were clearly terrified of him in a way that suggested he was more than simply Mayor Federer's relative. What's more, these people had said that the mayor was inside. If this man who had just flown to the top of the building and back really was Johnny Federer, why hadn't the mayor come out himself to speak to him? At no point had anyone used Charles's name, but there was only one person she could think of who might scare these people out of using his name, and that was Charles himself. Charles saw the look of realization in Helen's eyes. It was clear he could uphold the pretense no longer. I am Charles Federer, he said. She felt dazed, as though the wind had been knocked out of her. When she collected herself, though, she found a strange sense of happiness descend. She had never been given to mindlessly worshipping celebrities, but her time with Charles over the last few days had shown her how easily one could be drawn under the spell of an idol. Realizing in an instant that the man she had been seeking all along had been by her side all this time, her heart was filled with joy. At the same time, she felt once again that none of this was real, that she was living through a dream. A beautiful dream with her hero standing right in front of her. Charles felt a little awkward about the way she was looking at him. Although he had had many followers, he had never been pursued as an idol before. In the new era, after all, when most parts of life had been stripped back to their essentials, there wasn't space for hero worship. The weak followed the strong, and it didn't get more complicated than that. Meanwhile, Hugh, Tina, and Tommy had been very efficient at drawing the information out of the men. When the Dawn Alliance had first been established, there had been 7 deputy chiefs. 5 of these had later become deputy mayors, with Olivia the most important. Also among the deputy mayors had been Neil, who had died in battle. According to James's men, he had died after Alex had convinced him to take up the most dangerous position in the battle, where he was quickly wiped out. "This Alex sounds like a monster," said Helen. "I don't think he did anything wrong," said Charles. "How come?" she asked. "He tricked Neil. Surely you don't think that was the right thing to do?" "The greater a person's ability," said Charles, "the greater their responsibility." "If you want to be the leader of a team," said Hugh, "you have to be prepared to actually lead them. If you want the benefits of the position, you have to also accept the risks. You might think Alex was in the wrong, but in every one of Dawn City's battles, he always took the lead of his forces. In their battles with the insects and other enemies, Charles had ordered that unless they came across other paranormal troops, the Dawn Alliance paranormals had to stand aside and let the regular soldiers fight. It was important for the paranormals to reserve their energy for the more powerful enemies that came their way. When these strong enemies did come forward, it was the duty of the paranormals to take them on in turn. This had been Charles's method from the start. The strong and powerful would take responsibility and use their strength when it mattered the most. Even Charles himself abided by this principle. He had never shied away from the front line when circumstances called for it. He thought that if he was prepared to risk his life in battle when necessary, his followers should do the same. Alex had followed this principle to the letter. At no point had he backed away from the insects or Stellar Technologies army. Helen was at a loss. What kind of person sends his former superior to die at the front line? She wondered. But if he was following just Charles's lead, was it really his fault? "It comes down to one question," said Charles. "How much responsibility are you willing to bear? If you don't have the backbone to bear the weight that comes with power and authority, you'll be crushed by it. On the other hand, you have people like James here, who was smart enough to cave as soon as he saw his plan to take control from us was bound to fail." Tina looked at James coldly. "He still seems pretty stupid, daring to attack us in the first place." James didn't say anything. He simply lay there on the ground, whimpering. James knew that Charles would have killed him if he hadn't surrendered. However, the power he had held, however briefly, was so alluring that no sooner had he relinquished it than he wanted it back. Of course, in his predicament, this wasn't possible. He might once have been able to lure some followers by convincing them that they would benefit by taking his side, but after he had shown his cowardice in the face of danger, such supporters would be few and far between. He had revealed himself as the sort of person that Charles had just described, one who was desperate for power, but unwilling to take on the responsibilities that came with it. In fact, he had been this way all along. This was why his only option in the first place had been to borrow power from somewhere else. "These guys have been desperately trying to find information about the genetic enhancement serum," said Tina, relating what she had learned from James's men. "They had plans to sell the serum for a hefty profit, and then use the money to increase their power. They've been using your name, Charles, and the prestige of Dawn City that goes along with it, to amass as much data as they can in return for a reward they were never going to give out." It sobered Helen to hear that she'd been the victim of such a devious scam. In fact, if the people on the bus had done a better job of hiding the fact that they recognized Charles, she might never have uncovered it. "James," called Charles. But James didn't have the strength even to acknowledge him. "You've been using our power against us to grow your own. Right or wrong, it was a foolish move." He turned his gaze to the crowd. "The strong have different survival methods than the weak, but we all have to find our own way to live better and work harder. You might try to grow your own strength, or just do your best to live through another day. You might join with others as vulnerable as you, or aim to one day become a great leader. But you didn't choose any of these things." His tone turned fierce. "You had neither the determination of the strong, nor the resourcefulness of the weak. Instead, you decided to take on the guise of someone stronger than yourself. Where did you get the nerve?" By this point, James was terrified. Only at that moment could he see the magnitude of his error. Helen and the others reflected on Charles's words. While James's crew also fell into a sort of daze, understanding that their mistake hadn't been that they had gone against Charles, but that they had chosen to do so by allying with James. They had thought he would be able to bring them a brighter future, but now they saw he could bring them nothing. "Did you really think your plan would work?" asked Charles. "Did you really think you could assume the power of others to take what you thought belonged to you? The only reason any of these people chose to follow you is that they thought they were really following me and my people. The only value you ever had was as a former deputy chief of the Dawn Alliance. Now that that title's been stripped from you, do you have any value left?" James sobbed into the dirt. His original objection was that he had had no choice but to follow such a path. In reality, though, at no point had he been forced into a corner. Had he simply stepped out of the spotlight and turned to a quiet life, he would have been left well alone. Instead, he had shown himself to be unable to let go of his own greed, and too incompetent to satisfy it. And so he had made the decision to assume the power of this other party. At the time, he had thought it was his only hope, as though he had been drowning, and this was the last life raft thrown from the ship. But in his greed, he had lost sight of the fact that the reason he was drowning in the first place wasn't that he had been pushed overboard, but that he had dived in by his own volition in search of treasure underwater. His crew looked particularly downcast to see their leader in such a pathetic situation. They had lost all hope and confidence in him. "Mayor Federer," said one of them, "we recognize our mistakes. Please forgive us." They weren't above losing their dignity if it meant saving their skins. "I hope you can see the difference between a leader who sells you a pack of lies and one who lives up to his promises," Tommy said. He too had once followed the wrong person, so he understood better than many the importance of picking the right side. Charles pointed at James. "Kill him," he said to the crowd. "Then go ask Alex for forgiveness and find yourself someone worthy to follow. I don't want anything more to do with you. If you can't find a person worth following, go to the security team." James's eyes widened. He couldn't believe how quickly the tables had turned on him. The men who had until recently followed his every order descended on him. He was too shocked to resist as they moved in and killed him. His crew now realized the importance of choosing the right leader. Later, they would apologize to Alex. But when he found out that Charles hadn't harmed them but only their leader, he didn't dare to punish them. As Charles had said, their only choice was to join the security team, which had been his wish all along. Since they knew what came from following the wrong person, they would be fully loyal to his sister. They would no longer be tempted to turn elsewhere, because they knew where that led. By this strange logic, these people who had so easily turned against their true leader would become some of the most loyal soldiers in all of Dawn City. As far as Charles was concerned, loyalty wasn't some grand ideal, but simply the choice not to betray your leader. It was important then for a leader to constantly remind their followers that remaining devoted and obedient was more beneficial than rebelling. That was the challenge that Lena would have to overcome. If she could demonstrate the value in following her, her power would be secure. Charles was certain that she would achieve this goal. After all, if he hadn't considered her suitable to be in power, he would never have put her there in the first place. After dealing with James and his men, Tina asked Charles, "What are we going to do about the people inside? Do you want to interrogate them yourself?" The people inside were all from different parts of the country. As they were relatively new to the area, it made sense that they had been easily swayed by James and the others who had assumed Charles's power. Nevertheless, the fact that they had traveled so far and wide had given them the experience and resilience to make it through the toughest times, and they had grown to have exceptional survival skills and wits. "We can't kill them all, can we?" asked Tommy. He wasn't worried about the moral implications of killing so many people, but more about whether they would prove too many to overcome. One of the soldiers remaining from James's party said, "We were just following orders when we joined up with those people." "We didn't want anything to do with them," said another. "If it wasn't for James's order, we wouldn't have given them the time of day." "That's right," said another. "Don't think we're the same as them." They were afraid that Charles would change his mind and punish them after all. Instead, he ordered them to be silent while he considered his next move. Eventually, he decided that they would kill everyone in the factory and dispose of their bodies, including those of the sniper and those who had died in the explosion. Even if word got out that Charles had killed so many, people would believe him if he said that they had deserved it. After all, there weren't many who dared to question Charles. "Don't worry about who these people were, or about getting word to their families," Charles said as the others looked at him in shock. "Remember that they plotted a rebellion right under our noses. They had no qualms about taking on our identities, so we have no duty to honor theirs." It didn't matter to him that these people had reasons for their rebellion. They were new in the area and weren't used to the way Charles had been running things. But just because they had a motivation didn't mean Charles had to forgive them. To his mind, if everyone chose to rise up and exact vengeance whenever they felt like it, then society would deteriorate even further than it already had. He didn't care whereabouts in the country his followers had come from. He only cared that they followed him loyally and with a clear conscience. Since these people had broken this agreement, the standard modes of respect no longer applied to them. They had chosen to rebel, and so it was Charles's role as the mayor of Dawn City to punish them. "You're really going to kill everyone inside?" asked Helen. He didn't answer. He simply called for Hugh, Tommy, and Tina to pick up their weapons and rush into the factory. Within moments, screams could be heard from within. The people inside had been struggling and weak in the first place when they had joined up with James. They didn't have weapons to defend themselves, so it was clear that Tina and the other two, who had the extra benefit of having been trained by Charles, would make light work of them. Charles turned to Helen, who looked horrified. "Surely you can't be surprised," he said. "You already knew how many people I've killed. Why is it so hard to accept that I'm just doing what needs to be done?" "Hearing about killing is a lot easier than seeing it with your own eyes," Helen said quietly, and then she fell silent. It was true that the old books were full of legendary figures who only achieved their great successes by killing tens of thousands of people. This is where most of their power came from. But it was a lot different to be following such a figure and seeing his decisions moment by moment. It was difficult to appreciate, let alone accept, the ease with which he made his orders to kill, even though he had explained the thinking behind them. "Remember," he said, "the reason you were drawn to me from the beginning was that you'd heard how many enemies I've killed. I can tell you now that I killed every single one of them with a clear conscience." He fixed her with a serious stare. "The people inside that factory are no different. If I forgave them and allowed them to stay in Dawn City, fed them and gave them shelter, you can bet they'd use the very next opportunity to try to overthrow me again." Helen looked at her feet, not sure how to argue with this. "You have two options now," he continued. "You can leave. In fact, if you decide to leave, I'll even give you some supplies and weapons to help you on the way. Or else you can join Dawn City, either at my side or as an ordinary Dawnian. You don't have to rush to answer. Think about it. Take a look around Dawn City and see what you prefer." She was at a loss. She hadn't expected that this man, who had once been her hero, would reveal such a cruel streak. Still, she knew it would be impossible for her to go through life completely sheltered from the difficult decisions those in power had to make. She needed to make her choice and commit to it. Hugh, Tina, and Tommy walked out of the factory. The weapons in their hands were covered in blood. Tina's scarlet flame blade, originally bright red, was stained a muddy crimson. Charles raised his hand and used a fire exorcism amulet. Dark blue hellfire ignited the entire building, burning it to its foundations within minutes. Aided by Charles's preservation ability, which let him sense if anyone was left alive, there would be no sign of any survivors at all. The next morning, Helen came to Charles with her decision. "So soon?" he asked. She nodded. "I didn't need to think about it too long," she said. "I've seen many parts of the country since this all began, and I haven't seen any better than Dawn City." Although she said this casually, the words were momentous for Charles. He knew that Dawn City still had its rougher areas, and even those in the safer parts had to spend most of their days working hard and watching their backs. This was different from some of the survival bases, where the people in charge promised to take care of everybody to win over the hearts of as many as possible. Dawn City, on the other hand, attracted those wanting to work hard rather than those seeking protection. Of course, there would always be some who would point out that working hard was hardly a guarantee that you would become rich. But that was beside the point for most people. They didn't work hard to become rich, but simply because the work improved their lives. Besides, what good were great riches in a world where you might meet your death at any moment? "Very good," said Charles. "A sensible decision." He was proud of how quickly Helen had adjusted her mentality to the rules of this new world. He could tell that she was a good person, but also that she had the wits to ensure she would survive a long while yet. "Why sensible?" she asked. "Danger and opportunity often coexist," he said. "If you stay by my side, I can promise you'll encounter a great many opportunities. At the same time, I can't deny that we have many enemies. You'll need to be able to look after yourself.
When faced with a swarm of bugs or horde of zombies, most ordinary people would have a chance to escape. But Charles and his close circle, who enjoyed the most benefits as members of Dawn City, had the responsibility to stay at the front lines and fight. If they tried to flee even once, their standing as the leaders of Dawn City would be tarnished forever. They bore this weight together. "I believe in taking responsibility for our choices," said Helen. "Most people only care about the benefits that come with following me," Charles replied. "They don't appreciate the risks involved, and at the first sign of danger they run for the hills." He could think of many people who had taken to his side early on, only to back away later. He didn't think that his standards were too high. The reason they had chosen to follow him in the first place was that they had seen the benefits of doing so. They were certainly greater than those offered by his other deputy mayors. But when it had come time to face the zombie hordes, they had decided that the benefits of staying at his side didn't make up for the incredible risk. He hadn't forced them to stay. He understood that everyone's endurance for threats was different. He was happy to offer these people a place in his security team, which involved less of a threat than being in his actual army. Cowardice was hardly a war crime after all, and Dawn City made a good stronghold for people better suited to staying out of harm's way. Of course, choosing this less risky position also meant giving up on many benefits. Charles spent the next 3 days quietly cultivating. He made contact with the Cerberus pack and learned that Cerberus had gone to the Hellish Ocean. The original owner of his ancient book had set aside an area of hell for the Cerberus pack to rest and recuperate. To protect this territory, though, they needed sufficient strength. When their master had disappeared, the pack's territory had shrunk. Although there were safeguards against sufficiently powerful beings setting foot in the territory, creatures native to the area still posed a significant threat. Some of the Cerberuses had even decided to leave and rely on their own strength to survive elsewhere. After they had broken through to level 7, the Cerberuses were preparing to use their newfound strength to reclaim some of their original territory. However, Charles stopped them, warning that if news spread that they were regaining their strength, their enemies would come flooding to them to suppress them once and for all. "It's more important to make sure you can control the territory you already have," he said. Back in his quarters, he considered his plans. "I wanted to wait for Alice to gain more control over the Gate of Hell before building the Knight's Order," he thought. "But if I can get the help of the Cerberus pack, creating the Order will become much easier." In fact, the help of the Cerberus pack would help Charles achieve his plan months ahead of schedule. Tina knocked on his door. "Someone from the Explorers Guild wants to see you," she said. "I thought he was a liar, but he says he knows the location of the Phantasm Stone. Should I let him in?" The mention of the Explorers Guild made Charles sit up. "What's his name?" he asked. Tina frowned, unsure of what Charles was thinking. "Christopher Jones," she said. He stood up, a grin spreading across his face. "Let him in quickly." Tina could see he was clearly eager to speak to someone in the Explorers Guild. What she didn't know was that Charles knew of Christopher Jones, who would be famous in the future. Unfortunately, he would only become so after his death. At Charles's command, the thin, malnourished young man was invited into the living room. Christopher Jones, Charles thought. It really is him. Looking at the haggard young man in front of him, dressed in rags and sporting a bun on his head, Charles thought about everything he knew about Christopher. Christopher was a member of the Explorers' Guild who was proficient in energy gazing. This technique didn't enable him to directly observe a person's past or future, but rather it allowed him to see any changes in the energy of heaven and earth and make predictions based on their fluctuations. Such a skill wasn't particularly useful at the moment, but as the apocalypse continued to push forward and new enemies appeared, it would prove to be invaluable. Christopher could predict the location and time of the enemy's attack by observing any fluctuations in energy. He could even roughly estimate the size and strength of the enemy at the same time. But not many people accepted nor appreciated his viewpoint. Nevertheless, the Explorers Guild persisted on its own path. It recorded everything that it predicted, and then it compiled the information into a book. Unfortunately, before the book had been completed during Charles's previous life, Christopher had already starved to death in a remote location. Only after the monsters had arrived had someone found his body. When that person had looked beside Christopher's corpse and had found the book, which had the date of the zombie invasion recorded inside, he had realized the power that it held. The book's existence had allowed a specific part of the country to repeatedly predict the enemy's landing location and make numerous preparations in advance. Because of the book's guidance, they had been the region with the least damage from the subsequent attacks. Regardless of how useful his insights and predictions had proven to be, Christopher had died as a scorned genius. Colonel Richard Morrison had felt sorry for himself for not being able to discover and protect such a tremendous talent in time. If Christopher Jones was still here, twice as many people would have survived, he had thought in despair. And as the apocalypse had progressed, it had proven that Richard had been right. Since Christopher had taken the initiative to meet with Charles in this new era, Charles had no intention of making the same mistake the others had regarding the man's talent. Christopher looked at Charles's intense eyes and felt a chill down his spine. Why is he looking at me like that? Christopher wondered, feeling like Charles was staring at him like he was some sort of treasure trove. I heard you're part of the Explorers Guild, Charles said. So, what's so special about you? Charles wanted to know if the man in front of him was indeed the famous Christopher Jones from his past life. Christopher didn't act like a calculating con man who was trying to trick Charles. Instead, he looked hesitant. Come on, hurry up and say it, Hugh urged. Like many others, Hugh was very wary of liars and cheats. Many people refused to believe things they didn't understand, and only believed what they knew to be true, especially when their survival was potentially at stake. Christopher carefully said, I don't want to say too much. Charles grinned. You're stuck in the past, he said. This is a new era. Just say what's on your mind, and you won't be punished for anything. Christopher swallowed and pointed down at his feet. I can feel that Dawn City will face a great disaster in the future, he said. However, the source of the disaster is right under our feet. Or even, seeing that Charles didn't seem to be angry, Christopher became bold. Then he pointed in the direction of a room and said, The source of the disaster might be in there. How dare you! Tina pulled out her knife and prepared to kill Christopher for his arrogance. He was pointing at Alice's room. Was he saying that she was the source of the potential disaster in Dawn City? No matter if what he had said was true or not, Tina thought his claim had offended Charles, and as Charles' subordinate, she had to take a stand. Stop, Charles shouted, stopping Tina's blade in midair. Tina wasn't convinced. Don't believe this man, she said. He has to be lying. If Charles believed the words of a liar and killed Alice, then his image would be completely ruined in Dawn City, and he would lose the Dawnian support. Christopher was sweating profusely. He could feel that Tina really wanted to kill him. If Charles hadn't stopped her in time, she would have cut him down on the spot. Hugh and Tommy took a step forward and stood beside Tina, ready to attack at a moment's notice. As Charles's loyal subordinates, they had to ensure that he wouldn't be taken advantage of. Tina, what he said isn't entirely wrong, Charles said. What's going on? She replied, confused. When the paranormals awaken their superpowers, they also awaken some knowledge about other worlds, including hell, he said. Some worlds will activate a spatial channel and invade other worlds. Now that Earth has changed, it's one of the targets of their invasion. However, there's a certain pattern to their invasion, and they need a certain medium. Christopher was also confused. He could sense the source of the disaster, but he couldn't sense the specific situation, so he didn't know what Charles was talking about. Alice has a gate of hell inside her body with the coordinates of hell inscribed into it, Charles explained, and a spatial channel can open and unlock the gate. If hell wants to invade us, Alice could be very useful to them. But since you know about this already, why didn't you think of a way to stop it? Tommy asked. Or is there no way to get rid of the gate of hell without harming Alice? Stop it, Charles said, cracking a strange smile. Now why would I do that? The gate of hell is the key to opening the passage. But if hell can open the passage to our world, we can open the passage to hell too. Waiting to defend has never been my style. What I want... His confident gaze swept across Hugh and the other two, and they shrunk from his stare as he boldly said, I want to launch a counterattack. Charles wants to launch a counterattack on hell itself? Tommy, Tina, and Hugh felt dizzy as this thought ran through their heads. They had talked a lot about the information they had about hell with others. The information each person obtained when they awakened was different, and they could learn from each other by discussing it. However, any matters involving Hell didn't seem like a pressing issue to most people, so they just treated them like something to be dealt with when the time came. Only those who had chatted with paranormals about Hell understood how truly terrifying a threat it was. On Earth, a level 5 paranormal was considered a top-notch master. But in Hell, level 5 wasn't impressive at all. It was merely the level at which a being was no longer treated as cannon fodder. In other words, the strongest person on Earth would be one of the weakest beings in Hell. Yet despite the huge gap in power levels, Charles still wanted to launch an attack there. "Don't get ahead of yourselves," he said as he looked at his followers. "I don't intend to be the enemy of all of Hell. Although Hell is strong as a whole, certain parts are weaker than others. Since there are monsters below level 3 in Hell, it means that they can still survive there. What I'd like to do is to find some remote corners and obtain some things that can't be found in our world." The 3 followers heaved a sigh of relief. If Charles had said at the start that he wanted to obtain things from Hell, they would have thought that he was crazy. But since he had startled them by saying he wanted to attack before explaining he only wanted to obtain things from a less dangerous area instead, the latter idea was much easier for them to accept. At the very least, it proved that Charles wasn't as foolish as he may have seemed. Moreover, it created the illusion that he fully knew what was going on with the matters between Earth and Hell. Tina, Tommy, and Hugh weren't innate paranormals, so they didn't know much. But since Charles was so confident, they had no choice but to believe him. They had all been present when Charles had summoned the Cerberus, which had proven to them that he had successfully been to Hell and back. "Mayor Federer, can I go now?" Christopher asked weakly. "What's the rush?" Charles asked. "You still haven't told me where the Phantasm Stone was found." Christopher looked at the map on the wall. He drew a circle on it and said, "This is the place you're looking for. It's pretty conspicuous, but it shouldn't be a problem for you to access." "So why haven't you asked for a reward yet?" Charles said. Christopher looked embarrassed. "Well, a friend of mine helped find the place. He said you'd already paid him for his efforts, so he gave me some money and asked me to pass the news on to you." Charles quickly realized that the young man in the market who had been selling the Phantasm Stone had to be Christopher's friend. He hadn't expected the young man would be so principled. He had thought the young man would probably just take the dagger and run, but he had given him the chance to make good on his word and reveal the source of the Phantasm Stone. He was surprised that the young man had even mobilized his friends to help. Seeing that Christopher seemed hesitant, Charles said, "Do you know how much of an impact your ability can have on humanity?" Christopher was silent for a moment, and then he quietly said, "Maybe it'll be useful someday." Although he seemed entirely unimposing and didn't have a way with words, his skilled perception of the energy of heaven and earth made him an incredible asset. It's not like he couldn't find a home here in Dawn City, Charles thought. He's just too kind for his own good. In Charles's past life, Christopher had starved to death because he had rejected everyone's attempts to recruit him. He had wholeheartedly wanted to continue to roam the country and warn people of the disaster that would come their way, but he had died in the process. In other words, he was a person who helped humanity before he helped himself, which was both his biggest strength and his most dire weakness. "The reason you told me about the stone's location is that you sensed the danger there and want to use my power to deal with the threat," Charles said. "I can promise you this. If you stay in Dawn City, you'll become one of us, and as long as you discover the danger, I'll be able to stop it." Christopher's eyes lit up. "Really?" he asked. Charles was right in his assessment of Christopher's hesitation. Although Christopher had the ability to detect danger, he didn't have the power to deal with it on his own, and he was too meek to ask someone else to handle things for him. But Charles was different. He was considered an expert in Montreal, and as the head of Dawn City, he had gained a formidable reputation during their battle with Stellar Technology. A person like him had more than enough power and confidence to solve dangerous problems. So, Charles's promise was worth more than gold to Christopher. "There's no point in lying to someone like you," Charles said with a smile. "What I said is true, and I'll prove it. If you ever feel like I didn't keep my promise, you can leave." If Charles had only had himself to worry about, he wouldn't have bothered dealing with these dangers. Even though he knew he might benefit from addressing them, they were far from a direct threat to him, so he wouldn't have considered them worth his while if he had been alone. But since he already had a powerful force backing him, as well as people he wanted to protect, Running away wasn't an option anymore. He knew that as the apocalypse progressed, no one would be able to survive alone anyway. He might have been able to hide in a dark corner by himself, but he couldn't put his loved ones in the sewers with him. Who would want to hide underground if they could live under the sun? Christopher thought for a few seconds, and then he said, "As long as you do your best to fulfill your promise, I'll do my best for you." "In that case, let's get moving," Charles said, and he quickly prepared to leave. "Tina, call Helen and Mark over, and find some people who'd be willing to come with us." He's heading off to battle just like that? Christopher thought in shock. Is fighting in hell no big deal to him? "Don't you guys need to prepare before going to war?" he asked. "Charles is all the preparation we need," Tommy replied, rolling his eyes. "Don't you know how powerful he is? As long as he's around, we'll do whatever we can to help him, no matter how ridiculous his plans might seem. You'll get used to it eventually." Charles may have seemed arrogant, but with his level of strength, not many dangers presented a serious threat to him. Even before he had condensed the divine seed and had learned the preservation ability, he had been able to escape from any danger he had faced. But after he had reached level 5, the divine seed continued to grow stronger and stronger, and his ability to laugh in the face of danger increased along with his strength. He knew that although hell might become a significant threat in the future, it wasn't the time to wield his newfound power unnecessarily. So instead, he saw the battle in hell as an opportunity to deploy his troops and provide them further training. After ordering Tina to gather the troops, Charles went to the 7th floor of the Watchtower. Following the battle with Stellar Technology, Dawn City had been rebuilt incredibly fast. Many military facilities had no longer been useful, which had simplified a lot of complicated work. Most of the work had involved the straightforward construction of a new city wall. Charles's Watchtower had also been rebuilt, and the structure had been restored to its original design. When Charles arrived at the 7th floor, he found Sylvia and Elena guarding Jenny as they waited for her to wake up. Seeing him arrive, Elena stood up. "Is it time for battle?" she asked. If she could have chosen what to do, she would have stayed by Jenny's side until she woke, so that she would be the first thing Jenny saw. But she knew that there was something special about her daughter, and she couldn't let herself sit idly by while others threatened to take Jenny because of it. Even someone like Charles, who was determined to protect Jenny with all his might, had to struggle to keep her safe from those who wanted her for their own nefarious purposes. So Elena thought that even if Jenny would never forgive her for leaving her side, she still wanted to have the power to protect her daughter without relying on any others, not even Charles. She was eager to fight for Jenny's sake. Charles nodded. Then he said to Sylvia, "I took something from the Deathwater monster's corpse that could replenish your energy." After Charles had killed the creature, he had found that the white stone he had taken out of its body was the core of its energy. Although he didn't know how to use the stone, he could still use a simple extraction method with it to repair any damage to one's vitality. When Sylvia had faced the bug swarm, she hadn't hesitated to exhaust all of her energy in order to save Miranda. And now that he had the white stone, Charles finally had a chance to repay her for her sacrifice. But Sylvia didn't seem pleased about his gift, and she looked out of the window with a distant expression. "I can't take that from you," she said. "Why not?" Charles asked, surprised. In the past, Sylvia had only served her god, and she hadn't had any feelings that had belonged to her and her alone. Even if she had been kind, she had been kind without wisdom. After she had experienced the cruel reality of the outside world, she had become aware of both the good and the bad sides of human nature. She had discovered that good and evil weren't like what was described in the books she had read while she had recuperated from her injuries. While watching over Jenny and listening to Elena tell her stories of their past, she had begun to understand how to look at everything in her own past and how to form her own feelings and opinions in her new life. "I just think it might be better if I stay here," she said as she gently gazed at Jenny. "That way, if I see something bad happen, I can try to stop it. Now that I have the power to protect others, I want to be sure to put it to good use." "I understand," Charles said. A dot of light appeared on his hand, and he pressed on Sylvia's forehead. "If you believe this from the bottom of your heart, then I respect your decision." He knew that Sylvia was too naive for the cold and unforgiving world around her. She was a person who had been brainwashed by religion, and when she had finally started to have her own thoughts, she had found that they weren't in line with the harsh reality of the outside world. For others, The tough truths of reality were undeniable, but Sylvia couldn't accept them. Her only wish was to have a much kinder world, a world filled with light and love instead of darkness and despair. Charles had injected the energy from the Deathwater monster's core into her body, which would help her slowly recover from her injuries. Since she only wanted a happier reality, he decided he would try his best to give it to her. He couldn't stand to watch her suffer. He smiled at her, and then he gestured for Elena to follow him out of the room. But as they reached the top of the staircase, Elena stopped and turned to look back at Sylvia. "Thank you for taking care of my daughter," she said. Then she turned around and left with Charles. Soon after Elena had left, Jenny's eyelashes suddenly moved. Charles and Elena arrived at the first floor, where Helen, who had been forcefully woken up, lay sleepily on the table as she waited for their arrival. When Charles appeared, Helen shivered with excitement. "Is it time to go?" she asked. Then she looked at Elena with a jealous expression as she noticed how close she was standing to Charles and how comfortable she seemed around him. Who is that woman and how does she know him? Helen wondered, narrowing her eyes. Charles noticed her staring at Elena and said, "Don't worry about Elena. Just focus on improving your own strength. That should be your biggest concern right now." Helen curled her lips into a forced smile and sat in silence. When she had sought to join Dawn City, she had envisioned it as a sort of paradise where she could live a carefree life, eat her fill, and sleep in peace. But although the mayor's mansion could satisfy her basic needs, her life there was nothing like she had imagined it would be. Instead of kicking back and relaxing, she had to work to earn her keep. While Tina gathered the crowd, Charles quietly thought about how to best use the ancient book. In his previous life, he had only focused on increasing his strength, and he hadn't discovered many of the ancient book's secrets. But now that he finally had the time to quietly think about it, he suddenly discovered a problem. He knew there were many divine abilities in the ancient book that he had yet to learn, so many that he couldn't possibly learn them all in his lifetime. If every extract amulet has its place to be used, then what about divine abilities? He wondered. Some divine abilities can be used together, while others have opposing or even overlapping relationships. But there are so many divine abilities in the book that it's impossible for one person to cultivate all of them. So why does the book explain them all? Charles hadn't thought too much about the diversity of divine abilities in the ancient book before, but as he examined it closer, a realization dawned on him. There are all sorts of special abilities in the book, including too many divine abilities to count, he thought. There are abilities for refining weapons, for making medicines or spell arrays, and more, and all of them are powerful stuff. His eyes widened as the pieces clicked together. This book isn't meant for one person to learn everything from, he thought. It's a record of all of the divine abilities that have ever been discovered. He knew that even though he was a talented cultivator, he would never be able to learn every ability in the book. Instead, he decided to focus his energy on learning the skills that would help him improve his fighting ability the most overall. He realized that it hadn't been his fault that he hadn't understood the purpose of the book in his previous life, because when he had obtained it, he had been focused entirely on revenge. Although he had established a survival base with his own strength, he had been labeled as a traitor to all of humanity. He had been betrayed by the other survivors in the base, and then he had been barely tolerated by those outside of it. He had lived as an outcast for several years until he had died alone. But things are different this time, he thought. Not everyone around me is loyal, but I know better now than to let others betray me like that again. I can trust them with some things too, but not anything too important. His gaze fell on Elena. The people he trusted the most were undoubtedly Alice, Miranda, and his other followers. But Elena was the person who craved power the most. Charles understood that when a person firmly wanted to protect something, they would become much stronger. However, the situation with Jenny posed a problem for all of Dawn City. Inside Jenny's body was a rare and powerful energy. If either a human or a monster could obtain just a portion of its power, it could help them break through their bottlenecks and move to the next level. And neither human nor monster would hesitate to kill Jenny, or worse, when trying to take her power from her. If Jenny were discovered, the entire city would be in danger. Charles knew that the best person to prevent this from happening was Elena, who would fight with her all to protect her daughter from harm. A thought suddenly flashed through his mind. Helen, when the troops get here, tell them to wait a little longer, he said. Then he turned to Elena and said, "There's something I need to talk with you about." He gestured for her to follow him into another room. Helen's eyes at first were filled with confusion, but then her face quickly turned red. "I didn't know he was such a pig," she scoffed. "What kind of hero acts like that? Doesn't he have better things to do right now?" Looking at the indignant Helen, Christopher rolled his eyes. "Are you just mad that it's not you in there with him instead?" he asked. "What are you talking about?" Helen replied, the red in her face deepening. "Even if he wanted me, I wouldn't do it." But as she thought more about it, she wondered what she would have done if Charles had asked her instead of Elena to follow him. When she realized what she had said, and the direction her mind was wandering, she quickly buried her head in her hands. Christopher comforted her. "Don't worry, he's just going to talk with her. Nothing else is going on in there. Don't get so worked up over it." He was right. Charles was too busy worrying about other matters to think about having another fling with a new lover, and he certainly wouldn't allow himself to fall in love again. Although Elena was beautiful, he knew if he fell in love with her, it would bring him a lot of trouble, and it would even make her doubt his capabilities as a leader. So Charles had decided not to pursue her unless she fell for him, and even then, he wouldn't have to reciprocate her feelings if he didn't want to. Elena was baffled, and a little worried by his sudden request to meet with her alone. Even if he wanted to make a move on me, it wouldn't be now, right? She wondered. Charles shut the door behind them and turned to her. "I have a way to quickly increase your strength, and I want to test it on you," he said, "but it's a bit dangerous." Elena was silent for a moment. "If something happens to me, will you protect Jenny?" She looked into his eyes pleadingly. Charles answered firmly, "Yes, but if I can't protect her, I won't let her fall into the wrong hands, even if that means I have to kill her. She's too important to let others take her away." "I understand," Elena said with a calm expression. "No matter how dangerous this method you want to test is, I'll survive it and become stronger." She could understand Charles's way of doing things, but protecting Jenny was more important than anything to her. She knew that if she wanted to ensure her daughter's safety above all else, she had to make herself strong enough to protect her. Her talent wasn't enough on its own, so she would have to take risks to grow stronger. Charles outstretched his hands in front of his chest, and soul energy gathered in his palms. Then a destructive sword energy formed between them. As the energy became stronger, his face turned pale. This was the test he had mentioned. He wanted to try to give a divine ability to Elena. He could only support one divine seed in his own body. Even if he could support two of them at the same time, the abilities they provided would only weaken each other's power. However, if he gave the second divine seed to one of his allies instead, he would be able to get around the problem. The divine ability he chose for Elena was the one he was most familiar with from his previous life, the Terminator sword ability. In Charles's previous life, when he had been at his wit's end, he had relied on the power of the Terminator sword ability to try to survive. But this divine ability was no longer suitable for him in his new life. As he discovered more of the preservation ability's power, the Terminator sword ability became less useful to him. This was also why he was curious about the person who had left behind the ancient book. There were so many divine abilities in it that several were redundant. "Concentrate your mind and refine it," Charles said, as he channeled the seed's energy into Elena's body. Then he placed a hand on her head and helped her to control it. An intense pain filled her entire body. She felt as if all her blood vessels were about to explode, but she gritted her teeth and stifled a scream. "Use your will to guide it." Charles's voice entered Elena's mind. She tried her best to ignore the pain in her body. Then she felt her strength increasing, and she guided the sword energy from within. At that moment, she felt as if there was a seed within her that was germinating. The sword energy had shot out from the seed, but she had guided it back in afterward. The injuries in her body began to gradually heal. "Do I need to keep using my own will to suppress the sword energy like this?" she wondered. Elena could feel that if she relaxed the suppression and guidance of the sword energy, then it would once again fill her limbs and bones and turn her into minced meat. Soon after, rays of spiritual light entered her body and suppressed the chaotic sword energy. As the sword energy gradually calmed down, she relaxed.
Just as I thought, Charles said, shaking his head. A level 4 can't support a divine seed in their body. I've sealed the seed's power for now. You only need to break the seal to use it, but it'll hurt you if you do. He sighed. You're not quite ready to break through to level 5 and control the seed's power fully on your own, so for the time being, you have to practice using the Terminator Sword ability. The more you use the power, the lower the chances of backlash from your body. Some people were born with fast cultivation speed, such as Zack. However, ascending through the levels quickly at the start of one's life didn't mean that someone would be far ahead of the others for long. After all, cultivation practice was a marathon, not a sprint. Those who were fast could only say that it was easier for them to reach the finish line than ordinary people. But in the end, they still had to rely on their own will to get there. Are we in for some rough battles ahead? Elena asked. Charles nodded. According to what Christopher had said, there were many monsters gathered in the underworld. Even if the Dawnians were strong enough to take them on, they still had to go through literal hell to do so. If Charles could establish an order of knights that he ruled like Arthur, it would be immensely helpful to Dawn City's survival. Their enemies were growing stronger as the apocalypse progressed, and only by becoming stronger themselves could the humans survive against the monsters. When Elena and Charles left the room, everyone looked at them oddly. Helen glanced at Elena, whose face was pale and her footsteps unsteady. Then she looked at Charles with disdain and thought, what a scumbag. Charles didn't bother to explain himself. Instead, he asked Tina, is everyone here? There's a total of 322 people, Tina replied. They're all here. But Olivia heard that we're going to war, so she sent some paranormals who are willing to fight with us. Olivia's action gave everyone a signal that she and Charles were truly working together. In fact, she was the person in charge of the greatest power in Dawn City, and Charles wouldn't refuse her help. Mark Garcia walked over to Charles, his face full of excitement. The training method you taught everyone is really coming in handy, he said. We're getting stronger by the day. If we run into those monsters again, we won't lose nearly as many soldiers in battle. Because these fighters didn't have the guidance of inherited knowledge, they were slightly weaker than the paranormals. To them, the most important thing wasn't how to increase their own strength, but how to control it and use it properly. The training method that Charles had given everyone seemed a little haphazard, but it allowed everyone to effectively adapt to their increased strength. Charles's training method was no secret, and many of the Dawnians had started to follow it on their own. Some people couldn't muster up the courage to begin their training, so they watched from the sidelines as the others increased their strength. Our target this time is 22 miles away, Charles said to the group of fighters. With your level of fitness after your training, you should be able to arrive within 2 hours. Then he turned to the group of 40 paranormals who had chosen to follow him into battle. You'll be walking with the others, he said. You're stronger than ordinary people, so this little hike should be no big deal. If you can't handle it, then you're in no shape to even go and scavenge for supplies. The paranormals lowered their heads, deep in thought about Charles's order. They knew that their efficiency when searching for resources was related to their bravery and strength. In places close to Dawn City, all the precious resources had already been looted, and only some of the less valuable resources were left. If the Dawnians wanted to gather more resources, they had to travel further outside of the city and bear more risks. Not everyone could drive a car, and cars could also be wrecked easily, so humans had to rely on their bodies to get them where they needed to go.